Etup. Sarah Bennett sat in the back row of courtroom 302, her dark eyes focused intently on Judge William Crawford as he presided over yet another case involving a young minority defendant. At 26, she was the youngest attorney at Johnson & Myers law firm, and for the past 6 months, she had spent every free moment observing this particular judge's courtroom. The young man standing before Judge Crawford today couldn't have been more than 16. His shoulders trembled slightly as the judge peered down at him from the bench, reading the charges for a minor shoplifting offense, a pack of cookies and a soda from the local convenience store. "Another one," Judge Crawford muttered, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "What do you have to say for yourself, young man?" Before the teenager could speak, his court-appointed attorney stepped forward, beginning to explain the circumstances. The boy's single mother had lost her job, they had no food at home, and it was his first offense. But Judge Crawford waved his hand dismissively. "I've heard enough of these excuses," he interrupted. 6 months juvenile detention. Next case. Sarah's hand tightened around her notepad, where she'd had documented similar scenarios playing out day after day. White teenagers with similar or worse offenses routinely received community service or probation in Judge Crawford's courtroom, while minority youth faced harsh sentences for even the smallest infractions. Back in her small apartment that evening, Sarah spread her research across her dining room table. Statistics, case files, and her own detailed notes painted a disturbing picture. In the past year alone, Judge Crawford had sentenced minority juveniles to detention facilities at a rate 8 times higher than their white counterparts for comparable offenses. "This has to stop," she whispered to herself, pushing her thick-rimmed glasses up her nose as she reviewed her findings for the 100th time. Sarah's path to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, she had watched countless friends and classmates get swallowed up by a justice system that seemed designed to work against them. Through determination and countless sleepless nights, she had earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School, graduating with honors. But instead of accepting lucrative offers from top firms, she had chosen to work where she felt she could make a real difference. As she stared at the wall of evidence before her, an idea began to form. It was risky, possibly career-ending if it went wrong, but it might be the only way to expose Judge Crawford's prejudices in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Sarah picked up her phone and called her best friend, Maria Rodriguez, a talented makeup artist who worked in theater. "Maria, I need your help with something unusual," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "How good are you at making someone look younger?" The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Sarah meticulously planned every detail of her transformation. She studied hundreds of cases where judges had been removed for misconduct, learning exactly what kind of evidence would be needed. She reached out to trusted journalists who had covered similar stories of judicial misconduct, laying the groundwork for when the story would break. During the day, she maintained her normal routine at the law firm, taking on extra cases to build up vacation time. At night, she worked with Maria, perfecting her disguise and practicing the mannerisms of a teenager. They experimented with different hairstyles, makeup techniques, and clothing combinations until they found the perfect balance. Young enough to be believable, but not so dramatic as to raise suspicions. Sarah also knew she needed to choose her crime carefully. It had to be minor enough to avoid serious consequences if things went wrong, but significant enough to land her in Judge Crawford's courtroom. After careful consideration, she settled on a plan that would guarantee her case would be heard by him. As September drew to a close, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror one final time in her natural appearance. Tomorrow, she would set her plan in motion. Her stomach churned with anxiety, but her resolve remained firm. She thought of the 16-year-old boy from the cookie theft case, now serving 6 months in juvenile detention. She thought of all the other young lives disrupted or derailed by Judge Crawford's biased rulings. Sometimes, she told her reflection, you have to break the rules to fix the system. With that, she turned off her lights and went to bed, knowing that the next few weeks would either end her career or change the justice system in her city forever. Either way, she couldn't live with herself that she didn't try. "Hold still," Maria murmured, carefully applying a special makeup technique that would make Sarah's skin appear younger. "We need to make sure this holds up under the courthouse lighting." Sarah's sophisticated business attire had been replaced with carefully selected thrift store finds, slightly oversized jeans, a plain purple hoodie, and worn sneakers. Her usually straightened hair had been styled into natural curls, making her appear more youthful. The thick-rimmed glasses she normally wore were replaced with contact lenses. "Remember," Maria said, stepping back to examine her work, "you need to maintain this look for at least 2 weeks. I taught you how to do the basic makeup, but come back to me every 3 days for touch-ups." Sarah nodded, studying her reflection. The change was remarkable. Gone was the polished Harvard graduate. In her place sat what appeared to be a 17-year-old girl. She had even practiced changing her walk and speech patterns, adopting the slight slouch and occasional slang of a teenager. "Now for the final test," Maria announced, pulling out her phone. She snapped several photos of Sarah under different lighting conditions, checking how the makeup would appear in photographs. "Perfect. Not even my theater colleagues would spot this as a disguise." The next phase of the transformation involved creating a believable backstory. Sarah had spent weeks crafting her alter ego. Jasmine Williams, a high school junior living with her grandmother. She had created fake social media accounts with carefully dated posts going back 2 years, complete with typical teenage photos and comments. To make her story more convincing, Sarah had rented a small room in her target neighborhood, the kind of place a struggling teenager might live. She filled it with second-hand furniture and appropriate personal items, old textbooks, poster-covered walls, and a cluttered desk with half-finished homework assignments. "What about your job?" Maria asked, concerned. "Won't people at the firm notice you're gone?" Sarah had thought this through carefully. "I told them I needed a month off to care for my sick aunt in Detroit. They know my family situation, so they didn't question it. I've cleared my caseload and set up automatic email responses." The hardest part of the transformation wasn't physical, it was psychological. Sarah had to completely immerse herself in the mindset of a teenager. She spent hours observing young people at local malls and fast food restaurants, noting their mannerisms, speech patterns, and social interactions. She even attended a few local high school basketball games, sitting in the student section and carefully studying how the teenagers behaved. Every detail mattered, from the way they held their phones to how they responded to authority figures. "The key," Sarah explained to Maria, "is to be forgettable. I need to blend in so perfectly that no one gives me a second glance." As evening approached, Sarah practiced walking and talking as Jasmine one final time. She had deliberately chosen to make her character quiet and slightly withdrawn, easier to maintain and less likely to attract unwanted attention. "What about your voice?" Maria asked. "You usually speak so, professionally." Sarah demonstrated the slight change in pitch and pattern she had practiced. "Like this," she said, her voice now carrying the slight uncertainty of a teenager. "I've been practicing for weeks. The key is consistency." The final step was memorizing her new identity's details. Sarah had created a complete background story. Favorite subjects in school, family history, even a fictional best friend who had recently moved away. Every detail had to be natural and believable. As the sun set, Sarah gathered her new belongings into a worn backpack, another carefully chosen prop. She had removed everything that could identify her as Sarah Bennett, including her bar association card and law firm ID. Those were safely locked away in a storage unit across town. "This is really happening," she whispered, looking at herself one final time in Maria's mirror. Maria hugged her friend tightly. "Be careful," she said. "And remember, if anything goes wrong, just call me, day or night." Sarah nodded, shouldering her backpack. As she left Maria's apartment, she fully stepped into character, adopting the slightly uncertain walk of a teenager. Tomorrow, Jasmine Williams would commit a minor offense carefully calculated to land her in Judge Crawford's courtroom. Walking down the darkening street, Sarah felt the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just risking her career. She was risking everything she had worked for since childhood. But as she thought about all the young lives Judge Crawford had impacted, she knew it was worth it. The transformation was complete. Now came the hard part. The halls of the county courthouse buzzed with the usual Monday morning activity as Jasmine Williams sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 302. Sarah's heart pounded beneath her oversized purple hoodie, but her carefully practiced teenage expression showed only nervous boredom. Her plan had worked perfectly. 3 days ago, She had deliberately shoplifted a textbook from the local bookstore, making sure to do it in clear view of the security cameras. The store owner, known for his strict policy against shoplifters, had pressed charges immediately. Just as she had predicted, her case had been assigned to Judge Crawford's courtroom. A court-appointed attorney, Mr. Thompson, sat beside her, flipping through her case file with obvious disinterest. She had met him briefly 10 minutes ago, and he had barely looked at her while mumbling something about a plea deal. "Jasmine Williams," the bailiff called out. "Judge Crawford's court is now in session." Sarah shuffled into the courtroom, keeping her eyes down and her shoulders slightly hunched, the perfect picture of a nervous teenager. She could feel Judge Crawford's gaze following her as she approached the defendant's table. "Another waste of my morning," Judge Crawford muttered, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. He glanced at the file before him. "Shoplifting. Why am I not surprised?" Mr. Thompson stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client." "Let me guess," Judge Crawford interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She's a good student. This is her first offense. She comes from a challenging home situation. Save it, counselor. I've heard it all before." Sarah kept her head down, but her trained legal mind was recording every word, every tone of dismissal. The judge's behavior was exactly what she had documented in other cases: the immediate assumptions, the lack of interest in circumstances, the condescending attitude. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, young lady," Judge Crawford demanded. Sarah raised her eyes slowly, maintaining the perfect balance of fear and defiance that she had practiced for weeks. Judge Crawford's face showed the familiar expression she had seen so many times from her spot in the back row, that mixture of contempt and predetermined judgment. "Well?" he asked, leaning forward. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Sarah made her voice crack slightly. "I needed the book for school, Your Honor. My grandmother couldn't afford." Of course, Judge Crawford cut her off with a wave of his hand. Always an excuse. "Tell me, Miss Williams, do you think stealing is the answer to your problems? Do you think that's how successful people behave?" The courtroom was silent. Sarah could feel the eyes of the other waiting defendants on her. She had seen this scene play out dozens of times, but experiencing it firsthand made her blood boil. Still, she maintained her character perfectly. "No, Your Honor," she whispered. "Speak up," Judge Crawford demanded. "This isn't a playground whisper session." "No, Your Honor," Sarah said louder, allowing a slight tremor in her voice. Judge Crawford leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, I see kids like you in my courtroom every day. You all think the world owes you something. You think you can just take what you want without consequences." Sarah watched as he picked up his gavel, already knowing what was coming. She had seen this pattern too many times to count. "Perhaps some time in juvenile detention will help adjust your attitude," he continued. "Teach you that actions have consequences." Mr. Thompson finally spoke up again. "Your Honor, this is her first offense. The book was worth less than $50. Perhaps community service." "Counselor," Judge Crawford cut him off sharply, "are you suggesting I don't know how to handle cases in my own courtroom?" Sarah noticed the young attorney deflate slightly. This, too, was familiar. How the judge intimidated court-appointed defenders into silence, effectively denying proper representation to young defendants. "No, Your Honor," Mr. Thompson mumbled. Judge Crawford turned his attention back to Sarah. "Miss Williams, I'm sentencing you to 30 days in juvenile detention. Perhaps that will give you time to think about your choices." Sarah allowed her eyes to widen in fear, her hands to tremble slightly. All part of the act. Inside, though, she was smiling. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Tomorrow, during her self-representation hearing, Judge Crawford would learn exactly who he had been talking down to. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Next case. As the bailiff approached to lead her away, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the courtroom window. Even she could hardly recognize the accomplished attorney beneath the teenage disguise. Judge Crawford had no idea what was coming. Judge Crawford barely glanced up as she entered, clearly expecting another routine hearing. Mr. Thompson, her court-appointed attorney, stood nervously beside her, already sweating despite the early hour. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice still carrying its practiced teenage uncertainty. I'd like to invoke my constitutional right to represent myself in this case. The change in Judge Crawford's demeanor was immediate. He looked up from his papers, his eyebrows rising in a mixture of amusement and disbelief. A few chuckles echoed from the gallery behind her. "Miss Williams," Judge Crawford said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this isn't a television show. Legal defense requires years of education and training. Do you really think you can handle this better than your court-appointed attorney?" Sarah stood straighter, but maintained her youthful appearance. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the risks, and I'm prepared to sign any necessary waivers acknowledging that I'm choosing to proceed pro se." The Latin term caused Judge Crawford to pause momentarily. He hadn't expected that level of legal knowledge from what appeared to be a teenage shoplifter. "Very well," he said after a moment, clearly expecting this to be entertaining. "Mr. Thompson, you're dismissed. Miss Williams, you understand that if you make this choice, you'll be held to the same standards as any other attorney in my courtroom." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, fighting to hide her smile. "I'd like to begin by filing several motions, if the court permits." From her carefully prepared folder, Sarah withdrew a stack of professionally drafted legal documents. She had spent weeks preparing them, making sure every citation was perfect, every argument airtight. "First, I move to dismiss the charges based on Brady violations," she began, her voice growing stronger. "The prosecution has failed to provide exculpatory evidence, specifically the complete security footage which would show mitigating circumstances." Judge Crawford's amused expression began to falter. The legal terminology flowing effortlessly from what appeared to be a teenage girl was clearly unsettling him. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "I'd like to cite State v. Henderson, where the Supreme Court held that." She launched into a detailed legal argument, watching as Judge Crawford's face shifted from confusion to concern. The prosecutor, who had been half-dozing through what he expected to be a routine hearing, suddenly sat up straight. He began frantically flipping through his case files, clearly unprepared for this level of legal challenge. "Your Honor," Sarah pressed on, "I'd also like to address the constitutional issues regarding selective prosecution. The statistical evidence suggests a troubling pattern of discriminatory charging decisions in this jurisdiction." Judge Crawford's face had turned an interesting shade of red. "Miss Williams," he interrupted, "where exactly did you learn about these legal precedents?" Sarah maintained her composure perfectly. "I believe the more relevant question, Your Honor, is whether my arguments have legal merit. As the Supreme Court stated in Ferretta v. California, the right to self-representation is a fundamental constitutional right, regardless of the defendant's age or formal legal training." The courtroom had fallen completely silent. The other attorneys waiting for their cases to be called had stopped their whispered conversations, all eyes now fixed on the unexpected legal drama unfolding before them. Additionally, Sarah continued, pulling out more documents, "I prepared a motion challenging the jurisdiction of this court based on procedural irregularities in the initial filing. The charging documents contain several critical defects that I believe warrant immediate dismissal." Judge Crawford was now leaning forward, studying Sarah intently. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by growing suspicion. Something wasn't adding up, and she could see him trying to piece it together. The prosecutor finally found his voice. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to review these unexpected motions." "Granted," Judge Crawford said quickly, clearly needing a moment to collect himself. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the courtroom began to clear, Sarah gathered her papers calmly. She had achieved exactly what she wanted, planting the first seeds of doubt in Judge Crawford's mind. The real revelation was still to come. She had successfully shattered his preconceptions about the teenage defendant before him. In just 15 minutes, she would begin the next phase of her plan, systematically dismantling not just these specific charges, but the entire pattern of prejudicial behavior that had brought her to this moment. When court resumed after the 15-minute recess, the atmosphere in courtroom 302 had changed dramatically. The gallery was now packed with attorneys and court staff who had heard whispers about the unusual proceedings. Judge Crawford returned to the bench looking distinctly unsettled, his earlier arrogance replaced by cautious attention. "Miss Williams," he began, this tone notably more formal than before, "you may continue with your motions." Sarah stood, knowing this was the moment she had meticulously planned for weeks. Thank you, Your Honor. Before I proceed, I believe it's time for some transparency before this court. She reached up and removed the carefully placed hairpin that had been holding her styled curls in place. As her hair fell differently around her face, she pulled out her contact lens case and replaced the colored contacts with her regular glasses. "My name is not Jasmine Williams," she announced, her voice now carrying its natural authority. "I am Sarah Bennett, licensed attorney and member of the State Bar Association, number 45,873. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Crawford's face drained of color as recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. He had seen her before, sitting quietly in his courtroom, observing cases for months. "Miss Bennett," Judge Crawford managed, his voice struggling to maintain control. "What is the meaning of this?" "Your Honor," Sarah replied, standing tall now, all traces of her teenage persona gone. "For the past 6 months, I have been documenting a disturbing pattern of judicial misconduct in this courtroom. The discriminatory treatment I received yesterday as a perceived minority teenager was not an isolated incident." She pulled out a thick binder of meticulously documented cases. "I have compiled statistical evidence showing that in your courtroom, minority youth receive sentences averaging 300% longer than their white counterparts for identical offenses. My personal experience yesterday merely confirmed what the data already showed." The prosecutor had risen to his feet, but seemed at a loss for words. The gallery was dead silent, every person leaning forward to catch every word. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear, "I have documented numerous instances of judicial bias, inappropriate comments, and violations of defendants' constitutional rights. All of this evidence has been submitted to the State Judicial Review Board, with copies sent to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." Judge Crawford's face had moved from pale to flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. You deliberately deceived this court." "No, Your Honor," Sarah countered firmly. "I exposed a pattern of systematic bias that could not be revealed any other way. Every senior partner of my firm was aware of this operation, as were several members of the State Bar Ethics Committee. They agreed this unusual approach was necessary given the severity of the situation." She turned to face the gallery, her voice carrying to every corner of the now packed courtroom. "Yesterday, this court sentenced what appeared to be a first-time teenage offender to 30 days in juvenile detention for stealing a textbook. Last week, a white teenager with 3 prior offenses received community service for stealing electronics worth 10 times as much." Judge Crawford banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." "Your Honor," Sarah pressed on, "you can adjourn this hearing, but you cannot stop what's already in motion. The evidence has been submitted, and the investigation has begun." The judge stood abruptly, his face now a dangerous shade of purple. "Bailiff, clear this courtroom." As people began filing out, Sarah calmly packed her documents. She had achieved exactly what she set out to do. Reporters were already gathering outside the courthouse, alerted by her carefully planned press release timed to coincide with this moment. Before leaving, she turned back to face Judge Crawford, who remained standing at his bench, visibly shaken. "Your Honor, every teenager you've sentenced unfairly over the years deserved better. They deserved what every American is promised: equal justice under law." With those words, she walked out of courtroom 302, her head held high. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. As she pushed through the courthouse doors into a sea of waiting reporters, Sarah knew that today marked the start of real change in their justice system. Behind her, through the courthouse windows, she could see Judge Crawford still standing at his bench, his world crumbling around him as the weight of his exposed prejudices finally came crashing down. Within hours of Sarah's revelation, the courthouse steps had become a media circus. Reporters from every major network crowded around as Sarah, now fully restored to her professional appearance, stood confidently at a makeshift podium. "What happened in that courtroom today was more than just a dramatic reveal," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "It was the culmination of months of careful documentation and investigation into a pattern of systematic discrimination that has affected hundreds of young lives." Inside the courthouse, Judge Crawford sat in his chambers, watching the live broadcast on his computer screen. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, which hadn't stopped ringing since the morning's events. His secretary had already informed him that representatives from the Judicial Review Board were on their way. Sarah continued her press conference, methodically laying out the evidence. Over the past 6 months, I'd personally witnessed and documented 147 cases involving juvenile defendants in Judge Crawford's courtroom. The data shows an undeniable pattern of racial bias in sentencing. She held up a thick binder. These transcripts show Judge Crawford consistently using different language and tone when addressing minority defendants. White juveniles were often described as making mistakes or having potential, while minority youth were labeled as troublemakers or heading down the wrong path. The crowd of reporters grew larger as more media outlets arrived. Among them stood Maria, Sarah's friend who had helped with the transformation, beaming with pride at her friend's courage. My own experience yesterday, Sarah explained, where I was immediately sentenced to juvenile detention for a first-time minor offense, stands in stark contrast to cases like that of Michael Wheeler, a white teenager who received only community service last month for his third shoplifting offense. Back in his chambers, Judge Crawford was now facing the arrival of the Judicial Review Board representatives. They entered without knocking, their faces grave. Judge Crawford, the lead investigator, began. We need to discuss the extensive evidence Ms. Bennett has submitted. Outside, Sarah was fielding questions from reporters. Ms. Bennett, weren't your actions a form of deception? One reporter called out. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. When systematic injustice becomes embedded in our legal system, sometimes unconventional methods are necessary to expose it. Every step of this investigation was reviewed and approved by the State Bar Ethics Committee. My actions were designed to protect the constitutional rights of hundreds of young people who face discrimination in our courts. The courthouse doors opened again, and Judge Crawford emerged, flanked by his attorney. The crowd of reporters immediately turned their attention to him, cameras flashing rapidly. Sarah stood her ground as Judge Crawford approached the microphone. Their eyes met across the crowd, the experienced judge and the young attorney who had exposed his prejudices. I have served on this bench for 23 years, Judge Crawford began, his voice lacking its usual authority. And for 23 years, Sarah interrupted firmly, you have allowed your personal biases to destroy young lives. This ends today. She turned back to the cameras, pulling out more documentation. I have here the stories of 50 former defendants from Judge Crawford's courtroom, all willing to testify about their experiences. Their stories paint a clear picture of institutional racism that cannot be ignored. The tension between them was palpable as Judge Crawford's attorney whispered something in his ear. The judge's face showed a mix of anger and fear. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I am announcing the formation of a legal aid clinic specifically designed to review and appeal unjust sentences handed down in this court over the past 5 years. The crowd erupted with questions, but Sarah remained focused. She could see other judges and courthouse staff watching from the windows above, knowing that her actions today would send shockwaves through the entire judicial system. Judge Crawford finally stepped back from the microphone, defeated. As he turned to leave, Sarah called out one final time. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps, every person who stands before a judge deserves equal justice under the law. That's not just a phrase we put on courthouse walls. It's a promise we make to every citizen of this country. The day wasn't over, but the confrontation had achieved its purpose. The truth was out, and there would be no going back to business as usual in courtroom 302. Sarah found herself sitting in a major network studio, facing an experienced interviewer who leaned forward intently. What made you take such an extraordinary step? The interviewer asked, as millions watched live across the country. I watched too many young lives being derailed by prejudice masquerading as justice, Sarah replied, her composure unwavering. When traditional methods failed to address the problem, I knew something unprecedented was needed. Social media platforms were ablaze with the story. #justice in disguise and #courtroom bias became trending topics. Video clips of Sarah's courtroom revelation went viral, with millions of views and shares. Legal experts from across the country weighed in, most praising her innovative approach to exposing systemic discrimination. Back in her office, Sarah sifted through thousands of emails. Many were from families sharing similar stories of bias they'd experienced in courtrooms across the country. Others came from law students and young attorneys, inspired by her courage to challenge the system from within. "Look at this," she said to Maria, who had stopped by with coffee. She held up a letter from a teenager who had been sentenced by Judge Crawford 2 years ago. He's in juvenile detention for stealing food when his family couldn't afford groceries. 6 months for a first offense, while another kid got probation for stealing a car. The story took another turn when national civil rights organizations became involved. The ACLU announced they would be partnering with Sarah to review similar patterns of bias in other jurisdictions. Civil rights leaders held press conferences supporting her actions and calling for widespread judicial reform. Judge Crawford's supporters tried to fight back, appearing on conservative news shows to denounce Sarah's methods. "This is a publicity stunt that undermines the dignity of our courts," one Judicial Association spokesperson claimed. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence Sarah had collected. Statistical analysis of Judge Crawford's sentencing patterns, conducted by independent researchers, confirmed what Sarah had documented: undeniable racial disparities that couldn't be explained by any factors other than bias. The story gained further momentum when several former defendants from Judge Crawford's court came forward. A local news station ran a powerful segment featuring young people whose lives had been impacted by his harsh sentencing practices. "I spent a year in juvenile detention for skipping school," one young man testified, tears in his eyes. "Meanwhile, my white classmate with the same number of absences got a warning and counseling." Sarah's law firm stood firmly behind her. The senior partners called a press conference to explain their role in supporting her investigation. "When Ms. Bennett brought this issue to our attention," the managing partner stated, "we recognized that conventional approaches weren't working. We fully supported her creative solution to exposing this injustice." The media coverage sparked a national conversation about judicial accountability. Legal scholars appeared on news programs discussing the need for better oversight of judges. Several state legislatures announced plans to review their judicial monitoring systems. Sarah's phone rang constantly with interview requests. She appeared on morning shows, evening news programs, and legal discussion panels. Each time, she steered the conversation back to the core issue. "This isn't about me or Judge Crawford," she would say. "This is about ensuring that every person who steps into a courtroom is treated fairly, regardless of their race or background." The story took another dramatic turn when several other judges from around the country voluntarily requested reviews of their own sentencing patterns. It seemed Sarah's actions had triggered a wave of self-examination within the judicial system. A month after the revelation, Sarah sat in her office late one evening, watching rain streak down the windows. Her desk was covered with letters from people sharing their stories and thanking her for taking a stand. "Did you ever imagine it would get this big?" Maria asked, helping her sort through the day's mail. Sarah picked up a crayon-drawn picture from a child whose older brother had been in Judge Crawford's court. It showed a figure in a superhero cape holding a law book. "No," Sarah replied softly, "but this is exactly why I became a lawyer. Sometimes justice needs more than just legal arguments. Sometimes it needs someone willing to show the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be." Outside her office, the media storm continued to swirl, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning of a much longer fight for justice. Judge Crawford had resigned under pressure from the Judicial Review Board, but his departure was just the beginning. A comprehensive review of his past cases had resulted in the overturning of hundreds of questionable sentences. Young people who had been unfairly imprisoned were being released, their records expunged. Sarah sat in her new office, larger than her previous one but still modest, reviewing the latest progress reports. She had established the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting discrimination in the court system. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings and thank you letters from families she had helped. "Miss Bennett," her assistant called from the doorway, "the new judicial training program participants are here." Sarah smiled and stood up. In the conference room, 20 judges from across the state waited for the mandatory bias awareness training that had become law following her exposé. Some looked uncomfortable, others interested, but all were there, a sign of real change. "Good morning," Sarah began, standing before them. 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom pretending to be someone else. Today, I'm here to help ensure no one else needs to go to such lengths to expose injustice. The training session was just one part of the sweeping reforms that have been implemented. Every courtroom in the district now had mandatory quarterly reviews of sentencing patterns. Independent observers regularly attended proceedings, and all judges were required to provide written explanations for any significant disparities in sentencing. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the Juvenile Detention Center, not to meet with detainees this time, but to inspect the new educational programs that have been implemented. The facility, once focused solely on punishment, now offered GED classes, vocational training, and counseling services. Our recidivism rates have dropped 30% since these programs started, the facility director reported proudly. Outside the detention center, Sarah ran into MOCKS, one of the first young people she had helped release after proving his sentence had been unfairly harsh. He was now working as a youth counselor, helping other teenagers navigate the legal system. "You changed everything," MOCKS told her, his voice full of emotion. "Not just for me, but for all of us." Back at her office, Sarah reviewed applications for the mentorship program she had established, connecting young people from underserved communities with legal professionals. The program had already helped dozens of high school students start their journey toward legal careers. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria. "Turn on the news." The state legislature was voting on the Bennett Act, a comprehensive judicial reform bill that would mandate regular reviews of sentencing patterns across all courts and establish an independent oversight committee. The vote is 72 to 28 in favor, the news anchor announced. The Bennett Act will become law next month. Sarah leaned back in her chair, remembering the nervous teenager she had pretended to be that day in court. The disguise was long gone, but its impact continued to ripple through the justice system. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A young woman stood there, clutching a folder. "Miss Bennett? I'm Jasmine, a real Jasmine," she added with a slight smile. "I'm starting law school next fall, and I was hoping to intern with your organization." Sarah smiled, recognizing the same determination in Jasmine's eyes that had driven her own journey. "Come in," she said warmly. "Let's talk about your future in law." As the day drew to a close, Sarah walked through the courthouse one last time. The building felt different now, not a place of fear and discrimination, but one of genuine justice and hope. A new plaque had been installed in the lobby, bearing words that Sarah had chosen herself. Justice is not merely about the law, but about the courage to ensure its fair application to all. She paused to read a text message from her old law firm. They were expanding their pro bono department and wanted her input on cases. Another message showed the latest statistics. Juvenile detention rates had dropped by 45% since the reforms began. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. Sarah thought about all the young lives that would now have a fair chance, all the future lawyers and judges who would carry forward the lessons learned from her bold action. The aftermath of her undercover operation had created more change than she had ever imagined possible, but as she looked at the stack of cases still needing review on her desk, she knew this was not the end, but rather a beginning. True justice, she had learned, was not a destination but a continuous journey, one that required vigilance, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost.